September 17th, 1944. A dirt road cutting through the Hürtgen Forest, Germany. Corporal James Hendricks lies behind a Browning M1919A4 machine gun, his fingers resting lightly on the spade grips. The forest floor is damp, smelling of pine needles and approaching rain. Through the gaps in the trees, he can hear them before he sees them. The grinding of gears, the metallic clink of equipment. Voices in German carried on the wind. An entire Wehrmacht supply column, maybe 20 vehicles, winding its way through the narrow passage below his concealed position. His platoon is gone, scattered or dead from the artillery barrage 3 hours earlier. It's just him now, 46 rounds left in the belt, and a decision that defies every page of the manual sitting back at Camp Shelby. The doctrine is clear. Sustained fire, suppress the enemy. Reveal your position only when support is guaranteed. But Hendricks has watched 3 machine gun teams die this week, all the same way. They fired, the enemy spotted the muzzle flash, and mortars erased them within 90 seconds. So he does something different. He waits. He breathes. And when he finally squeezes the trigger, it won't sound like any machine gun the Germans have ever tracked before. By September 1944, the war in Europe had reached a brutal stalemate along the German border. The euphoria of the Normandy breakout had evaporated in the dense forests and fortified villages of the West Wall. American forces, stretched thin after their rapid advance across France, now faced an enemy fighting on its own soil with desperate ferocity. The Hürtgen Forest, a 50-square-mile labyrinth of evergreens, ravines, and logging roads, became one of the most nightmarish battlegrounds of the entire Western Front. Visibility dropped to mere yards. Artillery trees burst, created deadly wooden shrapnel. And every trail, every clearing, every approach became a potential kill zone. In this environment, the machine gun became both salvation and death sentence. The M1919A4 Browning, weighing 41 pounds with its tripod, could deliver 500 rounds per minute at effective ranges beyond 800 yards. It was the backbone of American infantry firepower, capable of shredding entire squads and stopping counterattacks cold. But its effectiveness came with a fatal vulnerability. Every time a gunner opened fire, he announced his position to every enemy observer within half a mile. The muzzle flash, visible even in daylight, became a beacon. The distinctive sound, a hammering metallic rhythm, told trained ears exactly what they faced, and roughly where it sat. German doctrine had evolved specifically to counter this threat. Every infantry company traveled with dedicated spotters, soldiers trained to identify automatic weapons positions within seconds of engagement. They carried signal flares, radio sets, and most importantly, pre-plotted mortar coordinates for every likely ambush point along their routes. The system was brutally efficient. A German column under fire didn't need to locate the exact position of a machine gun. They only needed to identify a general area, and within 2 minutes, 81mm mortar rounds would saturate every square meter. American after-action reports from the Hürtgen noted that machine gun teams had an average survival time of less than 4 minutes once they opened fire on prepared enemy units. This created an impossible dilemma for gunners. Their weapon's entire purpose was to deliver sustained, overwhelming fire. But sustaining that fire meant dying. Some crews tried firing brief bursts before immediately displacing to alternate positions, but moving a 41-pound gun, ammunition, and tripod through thick forest under enemy observation was often suicide. Others attempted to camouflage their positions so thoroughly that muzzle flash became invisible. but heavy canvas or vegetation screens reduced the gun's field of fire to uselessness. A few experimental units tried coordinating simultaneous fire from multiple positions to confuse spotters, but this required radio communication that was unreliable in the dense terrain and perfect timing that was impossible under combat stress. The Germans, for their part, had turned spotter training into a science. Their observers learned to distinguish between different Allied weapons by sound alone. A bar fired in short, controlled bursts at 400 to 600 rounds per minute. A Browning .30 caliber had a faster, steadier rhythm. A .50 caliber had a deeper, slower cadence. More critically, they learned the patterns. American machine gunners trained at places like Fort Benning and Camp Shelby followed doctrine religiously. Doctrine said, acquire target, deliver 6 to 9 round burst, observe impact, adjust, deliver second burst. The rhythm was predictable. First burst, 2-second pause, second burst, 3-second pause for barrel cooling and observation. German spotters didn't need to see the gun. They just needed to hear that rhythm twice, triangulate from the sound, and call the fire mission. By autumn 1944, this deadly dance had killed hundreds of American machine gunners. Every crew knew the statistics, whispered in foxholes, and passed along during ammunition resupply. Open fire on a German column, you had maybe 3 minutes before the mortars came. Some gunners became paralyzed by the knowledge, holding fire until targets were impossibly close, wasting the weapon's range advantage. Others became reckless, firing wildly and dying fast. The manual had no answer for this problem because the manual assumed combined arms support, friendly artillery to suppress enemy mortars, air cover to destroy spotter positions, infantry to secure flanks. But in the Hürtgen, units operated in isolation, cut off by terrain and communication failures, and the machine gunner often found himself alone with a weapon that could kill dozens but would today almost certainly kill him first. The Hürtgen Forest campaign had begun in mid-September as what American commanders believed would be a straightforward push through lightly defended woodlands toward the Roer River dams. Intelligence suggested the Germans were beaten, disorganized, retreating. That intelligence was catastrophically wrong. The Wehrmacht had transformed the forest into a fortress, with interconnected bunker systems, pre-registered artillery zones, and infantry units that knew every trail and firing position. For the inexperienced American divisions thrown into this meat grinder, it became an education in industrial-scale killing. Corporal James Hendricks had arrived in theater 3 weeks earlier with the 28th Infantry Division, a Pennsylvania National Guard unit that had liberated Paris in August and expected the war to be over by Christmas. Instead, they found themselves assigned to capture a series of forest villages with names that meant nothing to American ears, but would later symbolize futility: Wassenack, Schmidt, Kommerscheid. Hendricks was a machine gunner because he was strong enough to carry the weapon and calm enough under fire to operate it effectively. He'd been a construction worker in Scranton before the war, accustomed to dangerous work that required steady hands and clear thinking. The Army had given him 4 weeks of training on the Browning at Camp Shelby, teaching him to field strip the weapon blindfolded, to time his bursts to prevent barrel overheating, and to coordinate fire with his assistant gunner and ammunition bearer. None of that training prepared him for the Hürtgen. His first week in combat, he watched a veteran gunner named Kowalski get killed exactly the way everyone said it would happen. Kowalski had set up in a perfect position overlooking a German patrol route, waited for a full squad to enter his kill zone, and then opened fire with textbook precision. He killed 7 men in the first 10 seconds. Then he traversed left, firing a second burst into the survivors, scrambling for cover. The sound echoed through the trees, that distinctive Browning hammer, impossible to miss. Somewhere in the forest, a German observer marked the position on a map and spoke into a radio. 90 seconds later, mortar rounds began falling. Kowalski tried to displace, but the gun was heavy, and the forest floor was treacherous with roots and mud. The third mortar round landed close enough that Hendricks, positioned 30 yards away, felt the concussion in his chest. When the smoke cleared, Kowalski and his assistant were simply gone, erased, the gun itself twisted into scrap metal. That night, huddled in a waterlogged foxhole, Hendricks had a conversation with Sergeant Davies, a regular Army NCO who'd survived North Africa and Sicily. Davies explained the mathematics of their situation with brutal clarity. The Germans were good at exactly one thing in this forest: killing machine gunners. They had the systems, the training, the discipline. American doctrine assumed mobility and combined arms. But in these woods, there was no mobility, no artillery support that could arrive in time, no air cover through the canopy. Davies said the only gunners surviving were the ones who broke doctrine, who did something unexpected, something the German spotters hadn't trained for. He didn't know what that something was. He just knew that by-the-book gunners were dying, and the few who lived were the ones improvising. Hendricks spent the next 2 weeks observing. He watched other crews operate, noted what worked and what didn't. He paid attention to German reactions when engaged. He noticed that enemy mortar fire was incredibly accurate, but only after they'd identified the gun position. He realized the Germans weren't guessing. They were calculating based on sound, flash, and firing pattern. The pattern was the key. Every American gunner fired the same way. Controlled beyond, rests with predictable intervals. The rhythm never changed because the manual never changed. It was like a signature, as distinctive as a fingerprint. On September 16th, Hendricks's platoon walked into a German ambush along a firebreak trail. Artillery caught them in the open. Half the platoon went down in the first 30 seconds. Hendricks and his assistant gunner, a kid from Ohio named Miller, managed to drag their weapon into a tree line before the second barrage hit. They spent the night separated from the rest of the company, watching German patrols sweep the area. By dawn, they heard vehicles approaching from the east, a supply column using the forest roads under cover of morning fog. Miller wanted to hide, let them pass. But Hendricks knew if that column reached its destination, it would resupply the German units currently pinning down what remained of their battalion. He made a decision that went against every instinct trained into him. He would engage, but he would do it differently. He'd been thinking about rhythm, about patterns, about how German spotters worked. They needed consistency to triangulate. They needed predictability to calculate. What if he gave them neither? What if instead of firing like a machine gun, he fired like multiple different guns, or like no gun they'd ever heard? The idea was forming, rough and untested, but it was something. Miller thought he was insane. Hendricks thought Miller was probably right. But the alternative was hiding, while men died, or firing properly, and dying himself. So he prepared to try something that existed nowhere in any manual, something born purely from desperation and observation: stagger fire. James Hendricks was 24 years old, married 7 months before shipping overseas. Carrying a photograph of his wife Margaret folded in waxed paper inside his helmet liner. He'd grown up during the Depression, learned early that survival often meant improvisation when resources failed. His father had taught him carpentry using mismatched tools and salvaged lumber, showing him that the book method wasn't always the only method. That childhood lesson, that creativity under constraint, could mean the difference between success and failure, had embedded itself deeper than any army training. Now, lying behind his gun, with his assistant gunner killed by shrapnel 20 minutes earlier, Hendricks faced the loneliest decision a soldier can make. No officers to consult, no radio contact, no backup. Just his judgment against doctrine, his instinct against the manual. His hands weren't shaking. That surprised him. He'd expected fear to manifest physically, but instead he felt an odd clarity, a narrowing of focus to the essential elements, the gun, the ammunition, the enemy, and the idea forming in his mind. He thought about Margaret. He thought about Kowalski dying by the book. Then he stopped thinking and started calculating angles, timing, and how to make one gun sound like chaos instead of precision. Standard American machine gun doctrine in 1944 emphasized fire discipline and ammunition conservation. A gunner was trained to fire in bursts of 6 to 9 rounds, pausing between bursts to observe impact and prevent barrel overheating. This created a predictable cadence: burst, pause, burst, pause. The Browning M1919A4 could theoretically fire 500 rounds per minute, but practical combat rate was closer to 150 rounds per minute when following proper procedure. This wasn't arbitrary caution. It was based on sound mechanical and tactical reasoning. Continuous fire caused barrel warping after approximately 200 rounds. Uncontrolled bursts wasted ammunition that resupply couldn't easily replace in forward positions. And most critically, pausing between bursts allowed the gunner to observe where rounds were impacting and adjust fire accordingly. But this doctrine assumed a static defensive position with supporting elements. It assumed the gunner had time to employ proper technique. It assumed the enemy wasn't actively hunting him with counter-battery systems designed specifically to exploit that predictability. In the Hürtgen, those assumptions had proven fatal. Hendricks understood that following doctrine meant announcing his position with mathematical precision. The Germans needed only 2 bursts to triangulate effectively, so he began conceptualizing something fundamentally different: irregular fire intervals that would sound like multiple guns, weapon malfunctions, or random harassing fire rather than a single fixed position engaging with purpose. German artillery spotters were among the best trained observers in any army. They understood that identifying enemy weapons wasn't just about seeing muzzle flash. It was about pattern recognition. A veteran spotter could distinguish between nervous, suppressive fire and deliberate, aimed fire. They knew that panicked troops fired wildly, while trained gunners fired systematically. More importantly, they'd learned that American machine gunners were disciplined almost to a fault. When a Browning opened up, it maintained consistent intervals because that's what the training demanded. This consistency was a gift to spotters. 2 bursts with standard intervals provided enough data to plot approximate coordinates. 3 bursts confirmed the position. By the 4th burst, mortars were already in flight. The spotter's entire system depended on predictability. They'd developed mental timing mechanisms, almost musical in nature, that let them recognize the signature rhythm of different weapons. Disrupt that rhythm, and you disrupted their calculation process. The human brain seeks patterns instinctively. It wants to categorize, to identify, to understand what it's hearing. A spotter hearing erratic fire would experience cognitive dissonance. Is it one gun or several? Is the gunner untrained, or is the weapon malfunctioning? Is this a fixed position or harassment fire from moving elements? Every second spent processing those questions was a second not spent calling fire missions. Hendricks didn't know the neuroscience, but he understood intuitively that confusion was a weapon, and unpredictability was armor. The Browning M1919A4 was a recoil-operated air-cooled machine gun that represented the pinnacle of John Browning's design philosophy: reliability through simplicity. Weighing 31 pounds without its tripod, it fired the standard .30-06 Springfield cartridge from fabric belts holding 250 rounds. The weapon's cyclic rate was fixed by its mechanical design. The recoil spring tension, bolt weight, and barrel length determined how fast it could cycle. This meant a trained ear could identify a Browning by its rate of fire alone, typically between 400 and 600 rounds per minute, depending on ammunition and maintenance condition. The gun had no rate reducer, no mechanism to vary its speed. What could be varied was the duration of each burst and the interval between bursts. The gunner controlled this through trigger discipline alone. A light touch produced short bursts. Sustained pressure created longer strings of fire. The tactical manual specified 6 to 9 rounds per burst because this balanced effectiveness against ammunition consumption and barrel heat. But the manual never addressed using irregular burst lengths and pauses as a deception technique. The weapon was mechanically capable of firing in any pattern the gunner chose: single rounds, long sustained bursts, or chaotic combinations of both. The limitation wasn't the gun's engineering. It was the doctrine that governed how men were trained to use it. The German supply column moving through the Hürtgen that morning consisted of 22 vehicles, 12 Opel Blitz trucks carrying ammunition and rations, 4 Kubelwagen utility vehicles with officers and communication equipment, 3 horse-drawn wagons hauling heavier supplies, and 3 half-tracks with mounted MG-42 machine guns for air defense and convoy protection. The column commander, a Hauptmann named Vogel, was a veteran of the Eastern Front who'd survived 2 years of Soviet ambushes. He'd learned to read terrain, to spot likely ambush positions, and to trust his spotters implicitly. Traveling with the column were 2 dedicated artillery observers with radio contact to mortar batteries positioned 3 kilometers west. These observers had been specifically trained at Bad Tölz in counter-ambush procedures. Their doctrine was elegant: identify automatic weapons fire, use sound triangulation, and visual confirmation to establish a firing position's location within a 100-meter radius, relay coordinates to mortars, and saturate the area within 90 seconds. The system had proven devastatingly effective throughout September. Vogel's convoys had been ambushed 4 times in the past 2 weeks. All 4 times, his spotters had eliminated the ambushers before suffering serious casualties. He traveled these roads with confidence because he had a system that worked, observers who were professionals, and mortars that responded with German precision. What Hendricks conceived in those desperate moments had no official name. Later, when intelligence officers tried to codify it, they called it stagger fire, though Hendricks himself never used that term. The concept was brutally simple: fire bursts of varying length with irregular intervals, creating an auditory signature that defied pattern recognition. Instead of the doctrinal burst-pause-burst rhythm, he would fire 3 rounds, pause 4 seconds, fire 15 rounds, pause 2 seconds, fire 7 rounds, pause 6 seconds, continuing with no predictable sequence. To a German spotter timing the intervals, it would sound like weapon malfunctions, multiple guns firing independently, or an undisciplined gunner panicking under stress. None of these would warrant immediate mortar fire. A malfunctioning gun would cease firing soon. Multiple guns suggested a larger ambush that required reconnaissance before committing fire support. An undisciplined gunner would empty his belt quickly and become irrelevant. The genius of the technique was that it exploited the spotter's training against him. His entire system depended on identifying organized, purposeful fire. Chaotic fire that still achieved kills created a cognitive paradox. The observer would hear rounds impacting targets, vehicles exploding, men dying, evidence of effective fire, but the auditory signature would suggest ineffective fire. This dissonance would create hesitation, and hesitation would give Hendricks the time he needed to do maximum damage before mortars arrived. It was improvisation elevated to innovation, born not from theory, but from watching men die and refusing to die the same way. The lead vehicle appeared through the morning fog at 0647 hours, a Kugelwagen with its canvas top down, an officer standing in the passenger seat surveying the road ahead with binoculars. Hendricks watched through the Browning's leaf sight as the column materialized like ghosts becoming solid. The vehicles moved slowly, perhaps 15 kilometers per hour, engines grinding in low gear on the rutted forest track. He could see soldiers sitting in the truck beds, rifles held casually, smoking cigarettes, talking. They didn't expect contact. The previous day's artillery had supposedly cleared this sector. Hendricks let the Kugelwagen pass his position. He let the second vehicle pass. He was waiting for the center of the column, the point where maximum vehicles would be trapped between destruction ahead and chaos behind. The seventh truck, an Opel Blitz loaded with ammunition crates, rolled into his kill zone. Hendricks aimed at the engine block, squeezed the trigger, and fired 3 rounds. The burst was so brief that his mind barely registered it. 3 metallic cracks, then silence. The rounds punched through the truck's grill. Steam erupted. The vehicle lurched, stalled, blocked the narrow road. Hendricks waited. 4 seconds passed. German voices shouted questions. Men began dismounting, unsure what had happened. Then he fired again, but this time 15 rounds in a sustained burst, traversing across the truck bed where soldiers clustered. Bodies fell. The canvas top shredded. He released the trigger immediately. The column erupted into chaos, but it was confused chaos, undirected. Soldiers dove for ditches. Officers screamed contradictory orders, but no one was returning effective fire because no one knew where the fire originated. The sound pattern was wrong. Those 3 rounds could have been anything: a rifle, a random shot. The longer burst sounded like a machine gun, but came from a different direction because Hendricks had shifted his point of aim without moving the gun itself, using the traverse mechanism to alter the angle. To ears trying to locate him, it seemed like 2 separate firing positions. 2 seconds later, he fired 7 rounds at a half-track, bringing its MG-42 to bear on the tree line. The burst hit the gunner and the ammunition feed. The half-track swerved, crashed into the disabled truck. Hendricks paused 6 seconds this time. He could hear German voices now, frantic, trying to coordinate. Someone was shouting about multiple ambushers. Someone else was calling for the spotters. He smiled grimly. They were reacting exactly as he'd hoped, treating this as a complex ambush instead of a single gun. His next burst was 11 rounds into another truck's fuel tank. The vehicle exploded with a concussive whump that sent smoke boiling into the canopy. Men were burning, screaming. The column was completely stalled now, vehicles nose to tail, unable to advance or retreat. This was the critical moment. Hendricks knew German spotters were somewhere in that mess, trying to work, trying to identify his position from sound and flash. He fired 4 rounds, paused 3 seconds, fired 19 rounds at a cluster of officers attempting to organize a response, paused 7 seconds, fired 2 rounds. The pattern was chaos, but the effect was systematic destruction. Every burst hit a priority target: vehicles, weapons, leaders. But the timing between bursts followed no logic a spotter could track. Hauptmann Vogel, crouched behind a disabled wagon, was screaming into a radio handset. His spotter, Obergefreiter Zimmermann, was trying to provide coordinates, but his report kept changing. Single automatic weapon, northwest sector, no, possibly 2 weapons, intermittent fire, cannot confirm fixed position. The radio crackled back, mortar crews demanding precise coordinates. Zimmermann couldn't provide them. The fire pattern was unlike anything in his training. It violated every principle of machine gun employment he knew. Professional gunners didn't fire like this. Erratic, seemingly random bursts, with no consistent interval. Yet the rounds were hitting with devastating accuracy. It made no tactical sense. Hendricks changed his belt, a 15-second vulnerability where he couldn't fire. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory from 100 training repetitions. He snapped the new belt into the feed tray, charged the weapon, and immediately fired 5 rounds before the Germans could capitalize on the silence. Then he paused 9 seconds, letting them think perhaps the gun had jammed, before unleashing a 23-round burst that turned a fleeing Kubelwagen into shredded metal and dead men. The column was dying by increments. 13 vehicles were now disabled or burning, their crews either dead, wounded, or scattered into the forest attempting to flank a threat they couldn't locate. Hendricks had fired approximately 140 rounds in 7 minutes, but those minutes felt compressed, stretched, existing in some alternate dimension where time lost meaning and only the next target mattered. His shoulder ached from the recoil. His ears rang despite the cotton wadding he'd see tuft in them. But his mind remained crystalline, calculating angles and timing with a clarity born from absolute commitment. The German response was fragmenting. Some soldiers were returning fire blindly into the tree line, wasting ammunition on shadows. Others were attempting to establish defensive positions behind disabled vehicles, following their training for ambush response. But without identified targets, without knowing where death was coming from, their discipline was eroding into survival instinct. Hendricks exploited every hesitation. When they paused to reload, he fired. When they tried to organize, he killed the organizers. When they attempted to drag wounded to cover, he let them, humanely, tactically, because men dragging casualties weren't fighting back. Zimmermann, the spotter, was experiencing something close to professional panic. He'd identified the weapon as a Browning .30 caliber based on its sound signature, but everything else was wrong. The gunner's position seemed to shift impossibly. One moment firing from 30 meters left, the next from 20 meters right. Yet no human could relocate a machine gun that quickly through dense forest. The intervals between fire made no sense. 4 seconds, then 2, then 6, then 3. No pattern, no logic. His training demanded pattern recognition, but there was no pattern to recognize. He'd seen nervous gunners fire erratically, but nervous gunners didn't hit targets with this precision. He'd heard malfunctioning weapons sputter intermittently, but malfunctioning weapons didn't maintain sustained tactical effect. This was something else, something outside his framework for understanding automatic weapons employment. He tried a different approach. Instead of plotting where the gun was firing from, he attempted to predict where it would fire next based on target priority. The Americans trained their gunners to engage crew-served weapons first, then officers, then vehicles, then infantry. But this gunner was violating that priority system too, seemingly selecting targets at random. Zimmermann felt a creeping realization that chilled him more than the incoming fire. This wasn't random at all. This was deliberate unpredictability. Someone had weaponized chaos. Hendricks fired 12 rounds into a cluster of Germans attempting to set up their own MG-42 in a hasty counterposition. The crew disintegrated. He paused 11 seconds, the longest interval yet, and heard German voices shouting that the firing had stopped, that perhaps the enemy was dead or displacing. Then he fired a 4-round burst that killed an officer holding a radio, followed immediately by a 9-round burst into ammunition crates on a burning truck. The secondary explosion sent wood fragments and metal spinning through the convoy like shrapnel. 3 more Germans went down. The psychological effect was now as devastating as the physical casualties. Survivors weren't just pinned down, they were mentally defeated by an enemy they couldn't understand. In military psychology, there's a threshold where soldiers transition from fighting back to simply trying to survive. The Germans were crossing that threshold. Some were abandoning their weapons and running into the forest. Others were lying flat, refusing to move, paralyzed by the impossibility of responding to a threat that behaved like no threat in their tactical universe. Vogel knew his convoy was finished. 22 vehicles, 96 men, reduced to burning wreckage and casualties by what his spotter still insisted was a single automatic weapon. It was impossible. It was happening. He made the only decision available to him. General withdrawal, every man for himself, abandon the supplies and escape into the forest. He gave the order over the radio, then smashed the handset so it wouldn't be captured. Men needed no encouragement. They fled. Hendricks watched them go through his gun sight. He could have continued firing, could have killed more as they retreated. But he'd achieved the tactical objective. The column was destroyed. The supplies would never reach their destination. And critically, he was still alive. He waited 15 minutes, weapon trained on the killing ground, ensuring no one returned. Then he carefully dismounted the Browning from its tripod, hoisted it onto his shoulder with the remaining ammunition belt, and began moving through the forest perpendicular to both the road and the German withdrawal route. He didn't know if American lines still existed. He didn't know if anyone would believe what he'd done. He only knew that somewhere in the past 23 minutes, he'd discovered something that doctrine hadn't taught him, something that might mean the difference between survival and extinction for other gunners in other forests. He kept walking, the weapon heavy across his shoulders, carrying the weight of innovation forged in desperation. Hendricks reached American lines 37 hours later, half-starved and moving on instinct alone. He'd navigated by compass through 13 kilometers of contested forest, avoiding German patrols and bypassing his own unit's defensive positions until he found a sector held by elements of the 4th Infantry Division. The sentries almost shot him before recognizing his uniform. He was carrying the Browning, 43 rounds of ammunition, and nothing else. His company had been listed as destroyed. He was officially missing, presumed dead. The first question the battalion intelligence officer asked wasn't about his survival. It was about the weapon. Why had he carried a 31-pound machine gun through hostile territory instead of abandoning it and moving faster? Hendricks's answer was simple. Because he had learned something important, and the gun was proof he'd actually done it. Within hours, he was sitting in a tent with a captain from 2nd Army Intelligence describing in precise detail what had happened on that forest road. The captain took notes, asked technical questions about burst lengths and timing intervals, and then asked the question that mattered. Could this technique be taught, or was it something only Hendricks could execute? Hendricks thought about it, then answered honestly. Any gunner with decent trigger discipline and a feel for rhythm could learn it. The hard part wasn't the mechanics. It was overcoming the training that insisted doctrine was survival, when sometimes doctrine was death. 3 days later, a reconnaissance patrol reached the ambush site. They found what Hendricks had described: a gutted convoy spread across 300 meters of forest road. American intelligence counted 14 destroyed vehicles, 6 abandoned but intact, and 2 that had been pushed off the road by German recovery crews before they withdrew from the sector entirely. Bodies had been removed, but blood trails and discarded equipment suggested casualties in the 30 to 40 range. Ammunition crates lay scattered and ruined. Supply manifests recovered from a burned Kubelwagen indicated the column had been carrying mortar rounds, machine gun ammunition, medical supplies, and rations intended for German units defending the village of Schmidt. That resupply never arrived. When American forces finally captured Schmidt 3 weeks later, prisoners reported their units had been critically short of ammunition during the defense, forcing them to ration rifle cartridges and a bandy on positions they might otherwise have held. The physical evidence confirmed Hendricks's account, but what interested intelligence officers more was what they didn't find: evidence of American casualties or expended American artillery shells. One man with one weapon had achieved what typically required a reinforced platoon or artillery strike. The ammunition count was equally startling. Hendricks estimated he'd fired between 140 and 160 rounds. Recovery teams found approximately 320 spent .30-06 casings at his firing position, suggesting he'd actually fired twice what he remembered in the compression and distortion of combat time. Even at 320 rounds, the efficiency was remarkable. Standard doctrine suggested a ratio of 10,000 rounds expended per enemy casualty in sustained combat. Hendricks had achieved roughly a 10-to-1 ratio, meaning every 10th round he fired had killed or wounded someone. That efficiency wasn't luck. It was the product of staying alive long enough to aim properly. German after-action reports, captured months later during the final collapse of Wehrmacht units in the Rhineland, provided the enemy perspective. The convoy commander, Hauptmann Vogel, had submitted a report claiming ambush by a reinforced American platoon employing multiple machine guns in coordinated fire. His artillery spotter, Zimmermann, filed a separate report that contradicted this assessment, noting the fire pattern suggested a single weapon, but one employed in a manner inconsistent with known American tactics. Zimmermann's report included a detailed analysis of the firing intervals and burst lengths, concluding that the gunner had deliberately varied his pattern to prevent triangulation. He recommended immediate updates to spotter training to account for this technique. There's no evidence the Wehrmacht imp lamented those changes before the war ended. More immediately relevant was how American units responded to Hendricks's technique. Within a week, Second Army distributed a classified memorandum to machine gun platoon leaders describing the engagement and recommending experimental trials of irregular fire patterns. The memo was careful not to mandate the technique. Doctrine was still doctrine, but it authorized gunners to employ tactical variation in firing rhythm when operating in isolated positions against enemy forces equipped with sound-ranging counter-battery capabilities. In plain English, if you're alone and they're hunting you, break the rules. The practical adoption of stagger fire varied wildly across units. Some machine gun platoons embraced it immediately, conducting training sessions where gunners practiced firing with randomized intervals using live ammunition on rear area ranges. Others rejected it as dangerous improvisation that violated sound principles developed over decades. The debate split along lines of combat experience. Units that had suffered heavy machine gun crew casualties in the Hürtgen were eager to try anything that might improve survival rates. Units that hadn't yet experienced the forest's particular hell viewed irregular fire as undisciplined and wasteful. Senior officers were similarly divided. Some saw Hendricks's success as proof that tactical flexibility could overcome doctrinal limitations. Others worried that encouraging deviation from established procedures would lead to chaos and diminished effectiveness. By November 1944, at least 3 other documented instances occurred where isolated American machine gunners employed similar techniques with varying degrees of success. A gunner with the 1st Infantry Division reported using irregular bursts during a German counterattack near Aachen, claiming he survived 12 minutes of sustained engagement before friendly forces arrived, far longer than the statistical average. Another incident involved a Navy corpsman-turned-gunner with the 9th Infantry Division who held a aid station perimeter alone for 18 minutes using what he described as crazy mixed-up firing that prevented German mortars from zeroing his position. A third case involved a gunner who attempted the technique but was killed anyway, suggesting it wasn't a guaranteed survival method, but rather an improvement over predictable firing patterns. The Army's Ordnance Department took interest from a different angle. Engineers began exploring whether mechanical modifications could facilitate irregular fire patterns without relying on gunner skill alone. Proposals included variable rate reducers, randomized burst limiters, and even experimental trigger mechanisms with built-in timing variations. None of these devices moved beyond prototype stage before war's end, partly due to manufacturing complexity and partly because field testing suggested skilled gunners could achieve better results manually than any mechanical system could automate. The human element, the ability to read tactical situations and adjust firing patterns in real time, proved impossible to replicate mechanically with 1940s technology. Hendricks himself never fired another shot in combat. In late October, he was reassigned to a training battalion in France, where he spent the war's final months teaching machine gun tactics to replacement troops heading toward the front. Army bureaucracy had recognized his value as an instructor, exceeded his value as a combat soldier. He taught the standard doctrine first, ensuring students understood the fundamentals. Then, in the final training session before units deployed forward, he taught what he called the other way, how to break the pattern when the pattern would get you killed. Some students embraced it. Others looked skeptical. Hendricks didn't argue. He simply told them what he'd learned, that survival sometimes required thinking past the manual, that desperation could birth innovation, and that the enemy's strengths could become vulnerabilities if you understood their systems well enough. The official recognition came in February 1945. Hendricks received the Silver Star for his actions on September 17th, the citation reading in carefully neutral language about exceptional gallantry and tactical proficiency in destroying an enemy convoy while operating in isolation from friendly forces. The medal said nothing about stagger fire, nothing about violating doctrine, nothing about confusing enemy spotters through auditory deception. Military citations rarely acknowledge the specifics of tactical innovation. They prefer general language that fits comfortably within established frameworks. But the gunners knew. The citations spread through machine gun crews like folklore, and with it came the story of how one man had survived by fighting smarter rather than by the book. Post-war analysis by military historians attempted to quantify the technique's broader impact. The data was inconclusive. Perhaps a dozen documented cases existed where gunners explicitly employed irregular fire patterns with demonstrable success. Hundreds of machine gunners died in the Hürtgen regardless of their firing technique. Because the forest itself was a killing ground where no tactical innovation could overcome overwhelming artillery, impossible terrain, and numerical superiority. But in the specific circumstance of an isolated gunner engaging enemy formations equipped with sound-ranging spotters, the technique appeared to improve survival rates from roughly 3 minutes to somewhere between 8 and 15 minutes. Still not long by any measure, but often long enough for the gunner to achieve tactical objectives or for reinforcements to arrive. In a campaign measured by yards gained and casualties suffered, any technique that kept effective weapons in action for even a few extra minutes represented meaningful advantage. Hendricks had given his fellow gunners those minutes, whether the use to them was up to them. Wars are won by industrial output, strategic planning, and masses of men following coordinated orders. But within that vast machinery of organized violence, there exist moments where individual ingenuity transcends doctrine, where a single soldier facing impossible circumstances discovers something the institutions could not teach. James Hendricks spent 23 minutes on a forest hillside doing what no manual authorized, what no training covered, what no officer commanded. He survived because he understood that the enemy's strength, their systematic, professional approach to hunting machine gunners, contained the seeds of its own defeat. Predictability is efficiency until it becomes vulnerability. The Germans had built a perfect system for killing gunners who fought by American doctrine. Hendricks simply stopped fighting by that doctrine. The broader lesson extends beyond one forest, one gun, one desperate morning. Modern warfare demands standardization, requires procedures that turn complex tasks into repeatable actions that thousands of soldiers can execute reliably. Doctrine exists because chaos kills. But doctrine also assumes certain battlefield conditions, certain enemy responses, certain tactical contexts. When those assumptions fail, as they did in the Hürtgen's isolated nightmare, doctrine can become a death sentence masquerading as wisdom. The soldiers who survive are often those who recognize when the rules no longer serve survival, who can improvise without abandoning discipline entirely, who understand the difference between chaos and controlled unpredictability. Hendricks returned to Scranton after the war, worked construction for 43 years, rarely spoke about his service. The gun he carried through 13 kilometers of hostile forest is catalogued somewhere in a military museum's storage, one of thousands of identical Brownings, bearing no marks to distinguish it from weapons that never achieved anything remarkable. The forest where he fought has regrown, the road long since reclaimed by nature, the burned vehicles salvaged for scrap decades ago. Nothing remains of that September morning except memory, documentation, and a technique that lives on in military small unit tactics manuals under the clinical heading Variable Fire Patterns for Counter-Observation Operations. The language is sterile, bureaucratic, stripped of context. But somewhere in that dry tactical text is the ghost of a young man who refused to die predictably, who weaponized confusion, and who proved that sometimes the greatest act of discipline is knowing precisely when to break the rules.